They say money reveals the truth about people, but I never thought it would be my own family who proved it to me. For 68 years I lived a life built on sacrifice, discipline, and a single goal in mind: to protect my daughter and her children. I wasn't born into wealth, and nothing was handed to me. Every dollar I earned came with calluses on my hands, sleepless nights, and meals I skipped so that my child never had to. By the time I retired, I had built something I once thought impossible: $1 million nest egg. It wasn't a lottery win or a sudden miracle. It was decades of scrubbing floors, picking up shifts when my body screamed for rest, saying no to vacations, and clipping coupons while everyone else indulged. That money was my proof that all those sacrifices weren't for nothing, and I had no greater joy than knowing it would one day give my daughter and my grandchildren the security I never had. But life has a way of showing you that love alone doesn't shield you from betrayal. My daughter married into a family I never fully trusted. From the very first day I met my son-in-law's parents, I felt the sharpness behind their smiles. They were the kind of people who judged worth not by kindness or integrity, but by the thickness of your wallet and the size of your house. They constantly asked invasive questions: how much I made from my pension, how much my house was worth, whether I had investments. At first, I brushed it off as nosiness, but over the years their fixation on money became suffocating. They would drop comments at family gatherings like, "It's a shame all that money will sit in an old woman's account when it could help a young family," or, "Isn't it time to think about your daughter's future?" It was always said with a smile, but the hunger in their eyes made my stomach turn. I never spoke much about my savings, but whispers have a way of leaking. My daughter, in her innocence, had mentioned once or twice that I had saved a good amount. And that was all it took. To a family fueled by entitlement, those words were like blood in the water. They circled me after that, slowly, cleverly, disguising their greed as concern. My son-in-law would tell me, "You don't need to handle finances at your age, let us help." His mother would insist, "It's dangerous to keep so much money under one name. What if something happens to you?" I knew manipulation when I saw it, but it hurt to see my daughter caught in the middle, torn between defending me and wanting to keep peace with her husband's family. I held firm, determined that my money was safe. I didn't flaunt it, I didn't live like a millionaire, and I kept the details hidden, tucked away in investments, savings accounts, and carefully organized papers. But even walls built over decades can be breached, especially when the enemy is family. The moment came quietly, without fanfare, just another day that began like any other. My daughter showed up at my house with papers in hand, her voice trembling but her smile forced. She told me she needed me to sign something to make things easier in case of emergencies. I remember the way her eyes darted away from mine, the way her husband hovered in the background like a shadow, and how my gut screamed at me that something was wrong. I resisted, questioned, but my daughter's voice cracked when she said, "Mom, please just trust me." That sentence pierced me deeper than any knife could. After all the years of giving up everything for her, how could I say no? So, against my better judgment, I signed. It wasn't until weeks later, when I went to check one of my accounts, that the devastation hit. The balance, which had once held the weight of my life's work, was gone. $1 million wiped clean, transferred out under my very nose. Panic rose in my chest as I flipped through statements, called banks, demanded answers. What I uncovered made my knees buckle. The signatures, the authorizations, all legally binding, all traced back to me. But they weren't mine. They were forged. My daughter's in-laws had orchestrated the entire thing, manipulating her, pressuring her, and using her trust in me to their advantage. I remember sitting in my small kitchen, staring at the empty balance with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Betrayal doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with silence, with the sound of your own heartbeat pounding in your ears as you realize the people you welcomed into your home, fed at your table, and called family have gutted you. My daughter cried when I confronted her. She claimed she didn't know, that she thought it was harmless paperwork, that her in-laws had promised it was just for safety. I wanted to believe her, but how could I, when the damage was already done? The worst part wasn't even the money, it was the humiliation. I had been careful my whole life, smart and cautious, yet in the end I had been fooled. Friends I had trusted avoided eye contact when they heard the whispers. Neighbors pitied me, muttering about how foolish I was to sign anything at my age. And those in-laws, they walked taller, wearing smug smiles as they paraded new cars, designer clothes, and boasted about investments that were funded by the very blood and sweat I had poured into my savings. That night, alone in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a silent promise. They thought they had taken everything from me, but they had underestimated one thing. I had survived poverty, widowhood, and decades of sacrifice. I was not about to let a family of leeches write the final chapter of my life. And so began the quiet stirring of something I hadn't felt in years. Anger mixed with resolve. They believed I was too old, too weak, too naive to fight back. But I knew something they didn't. Age doesn't kill your fire. It sharpens it. I wish I could say I had the luxury of time to process my anger. But life doesn't pause for you to lick your wounds. The moment my savings disappeared, everything in my world changed. Bills still came, groceries still had to be bought, and retirement suddenly felt like a cruel joke. That $1 million wasn't just comfort, it was my security, my insurance that I wouldn't have to depend on anyone in my old age. And now it was gone, funneled into the greedy hands of people who thought they could bleed me dry without consequence. They didn't even try to hide it. My son-in-law suddenly had a brand new SUV parked in his driveway. His mother flaunted diamond jewelry at family gatherings, and his father bragged about smart new investments that conveniently lined up with the exact week my money vanished. The audacity burned in my chest like acid. They laughed, they drank, they posted photos of their lavish dinners, and all the while I was left to explain to my bank why my accounts were empty. When I confronted my daughter again, I saw the same thing in her eyes that broke me the first time. Guilt mixed with helplessness. She admitted that her in-laws had pressured her, telling her I was old and vulnerable, that if she didn't act now she'd be left with nothing when I passed. They convinced her that this was just moving money for safety, and that I'd still have access. Only when it was too late did she realize the money had been siphoned completely into their control. Her tears didn't soothe me. They made me angrier because whether she had meant it or not, she had played a part in destroying my life's work. What stung even more was how the rest of the family reacted. Instead of outrage at the injustice, I was met with condescending pity. "You should have been more careful," they said. "At your age, it's easy to get confused." Confused? I hadn't been confused when I worked myself to the bone for decades. I wasn't confused when I built a fortune from nothing. But now, because I trusted my daughter, I was suddenly painted as senile, gullible, and pathetic. That narrative suited my in-laws perfectly. It made them look like saviors rather than thieves. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. I may have been quiet, but silence doesn't equal surrender. I began to watch them closely. Every social media post, every bragged about purchase, every smug smile at Sunday dinners was a thread I planned to pull. I started keeping notes, dates, times, receipts, overheard conversations. My mind, once filled with despair, sharpened with purpose. They thought they had buried me, but all they had done was plant the seed of my revenge. Still, it wasn't easy. I had sleepless nights, replaying every mistake in my head, feeling the weight of humiliation press against my chest. There were days when I doubted myself, when I wondered if maybe it was too late to fight back. But then I would see them again, living their lavish lives funded by my sacrifice, and the doubt burned away. I had been underestimated before in life, and every time I had proven people wrong. This would be no different. Their arrogance was their greatest weakness. They believed stealing my money had not only filled their pockets but also silenced me. At family gatherings, they made snide comments masked as jokes. "Retirement is hard when you don't have much left, isn't it?" Or good thing you have us to keep an eye on your finances. My daughter would shrink in embarrassment, but I forced myself to smile, even laugh along. Let them believe I was beaten. Let them lower their guard. Behind closed doors, I began assembling my arsenal. I dug out every document I had: bank statements, investment papers, correspondence. I went to the bank in person, demanded transaction histories, cross-referenced dates with the sudden surge in their expenses. I may not have had the money anymore, but what I had was evidence. And evidence, when wielded correctly, is far more powerful than cash. I also began reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. An old friend who now worked as a paralegal. A neighbor whose brother was a financial advisor. Even my former employer, who respected me enough to listen when I explained I had been defrauded. Each conversation gave me more clarity, more tools, and slowly I built the foundation of a case. Meanwhile, my daughter's marriage began to crack under the weight of her in-laws' greed. She had believed their promises that this was for the good of the family, but once the money was secured, they stopped pretending to care about her input. Decisions were made without her. Her husband grew more controlling, and the lavish lifestyle came at the cost of their relationship. I watched quietly as the cracks widened, torn between wanting to comfort her and wanting her to face the consequences of siding with vipers. The breaking point came one evening when I overheard my son-in-law's parents bragging openly at a gathering about how stupid old people shouldn't be allowed to control money. My blood boiled, but I bit my tongue. Outrage wouldn't win me justice, strategy would. And in that moment, their arrogance gave me exactly what I needed. Confirmation that they thought they were untouchable. I went home that night and stared at the empty balance on my account once again. But this time I didn't feel helpless. I felt ready. The plan forming in my mind wasn't just about reclaiming my money, it was about making sure every single one of them paid for underestimating me. When the first wave of grief settled, I realized something important. I wasn't going to get back those $1 million by begging. Pleading with people who had already crossed every moral boundary wasn't just humiliating. It was pointless. My daughter's in-laws had convinced themselves that what they did was justified, that they deserved to live off my lifetime of savings, and they weren't about to return it just because I asked. For a short while, I felt completely powerless. I was just one old woman, widowed, living on memories and routines, while they strutted around in the prime of their lives, using my money to fund their parties, buy their expensive clothes, and pretend they were a family of status. But the thing about being underestimated is that it gives you an edge. They thought I was too old, too frail, too naive to fight back. They assumed I didn't know anything about finance, law, or technology. They assumed I'd sit quietly in a corner until I died, and they'd be free to enjoy what they'd stolen without consequence. That's when I decided to stop playing the helpless victim and start playing the long game. I wasn't just going to take back what they stole, I was going to make them choke on their arrogance. The first step was simple: information. People reveal more than they realize when they think no one is paying attention, and I had the advantage of being the person they thought was invisible. Every visit they made, every careless word they let slip, I memorized. I learned where the money was being spent. They had bought a second house in another neighborhood, pretending it was an investment property. They were bragging about how their son was about to quit his job and start some flashy business because now he had capital. The arrogance made me sick, but it also handed me the tools I needed. They weren't hiding the money very well, and worse for them, they left a trail. While they were busy showing off their new lifestyle, I started quietly documenting everything. My late husband had taught me a thing or two about record keeping. Bank accounts, receipts, conversations. I began building a file. But paperwork alone wasn't enough. I needed leverage. That's when I remembered something I had once overheard. They had taken out loans before, hiding the fact that they were already drowning in debt. They were banking on my $1 million to pull them out of the pit they had dug themselves into. Without it, they would have gone bankrupt. That realization lit a fire inside me. They hadn't stolen from me just because they wanted more, they had stolen from me because they were desperate. and desperate people make mistakes. So I reached out quietly to an old friend of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years but who worked in finance. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to ask the right questions. Slowly, piece by piece, I started seeing the cracks in their facade. Their new business wasn't registered properly, their second property had legal issues, and they were funneling money into accounts that didn't match up with their declared income. The arrogance had blinded them to the basics of covering their tracks. They thought I wouldn't even know how to ask these questions, but I was smarter than they ever gave me credit for. And here's where things turned deliciously ironic. My son-in-law's family had put my name on some of their paperwork, assuming that since I was old, I wouldn't notice. They thought it would help them with taxes and credibility. They thought I'd never question it. Instead, it gave me legal standing in places they hadn't anticipated. The very arrogance that led them to steal from me had also handed me the tools to dismantle them. The next step was the hardest, waiting. I wanted to strike immediately, to scream in their faces and demand my money back, but timing mattered. I needed them comfortable. I needed them confident. I needed them to believe they had already won. That way, when I finally moved, the shock would cut deeper. So I kept quiet, playing the role of the heartbroken, helpless grandmother. I nodded politely when they paraded around in their expensive new clothes. I smiled faintly when they bragged about their new business venture. I even let them mock me, call me old-fashioned, and dismiss me when I hinted at fairness. Every insult, every smug laugh, every boast. They were adding fuel to the fire of my determination. My daughter, bless her, was caught in the middle, and I could see her pain. She tried to defend me sometimes, but they had already poisoned her heart with manipulation. They made her feel like siding with me meant betraying her husband. I didn't blame her, I just waited. I knew the truth would eventually unravel everything. Finally, I had my plan. With my documentation, my legal standing, and the knowledge of their weak points, I reached out to a lawyer. A young, sharp woman who didn't see me as just another old lady. When I laid out my evidence, her eyes widened and then she smiled. "We've got them," she said. And for the first time since my million had been stolen, I felt the weight lift from my chest. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't broken. They thought they had buried me. But I was the seed. And I was about to bloom in a way they could never have imagined. The beauty of a well-executed plan is that when it all comes together, it doesn't explode with noise. It falls apart quietly for the guilty, like a foundation rotting until the whole house collapses. I didn't need to yell, scream, or throw accusations in a heated room. I just had to stand still while the truth crushed them under its own weight. The day everything unraveled began with an unexpected knock at the Sharma household. It was not the police as they had feared. It was worse. A court officer arrived with formal papers, fraud charges, embezzlement investigations, and an immediate freeze on their assets. The $1 million they thought they had safely tucked away was no longer theirs to touch. The banks froze their accounts before they even had time to move funds into hidden corners. All the luxury cars, the jewelry, the gold plates they boasted about at every family gathering, they were tagged for seizure. Their pride became evidence. They weren't untouchable anymore. They were suffocating in a net they thought would never reach them. First, they tried to play it cool. My son-in-law's father boomed about how this was all a mistake, some clerical error, and that his reputation would protect him. His wife cried loudly, asking how someone could do this to such a respectable family. And my son-in-law, poor boy, stood in the middle like a deer in headlights, realizing the castle he thought he married into was made of sand. He had mocked me once for being old-fashioned, but that day, his head was bowed lower than mine had ever been. His parents begged him to stand with them, to help fight this case, but his own shame silenced him. And my daughter, my sweet betrayed daughter, finally stood up not just for me but for herself. She told her in-laws, loud enough for everyone to hear, that stealing from her mother had been their gravest mistake. "You didn't just take her money," she said. You took her trust. And that is something you can never pay back. I saw tears in her eyes, but there was no weakness in her voice. For the first time, she wasn't their silent daughter-in-law. She was my daughter, with a fire I had always known lived in her. As the case went public, their status crumbled. The man who once walked into his office with his chest puffed out couldn't even get past the front desk anymore. Business partners pulled away, whispers spread in the neighborhood, and friends avoided their calls. Invitations to weddings and functions disappeared overnight. They weren't respected anymore. They were pitted. And worse, they were feared, not for their power but for the shame they carried. Their son, my son-in-law, tried to salvage his marriage by turning to my daughter with apologies. But she knew better now. She saw that his loyalty had never been to her, only to his parents' wealth. She told him she wouldn't live as a pawn in their game anymore. And so, while his family crumbled, my daughter walked out of their home with her head high, carrying nothing but her dignity. And what about me, the woman they thought was too old to fight back? I stood taller than ever. The money that was once stolen was not just returned, it multiplied. Because once the fraud was exposed, investments I had kept in my own name soared. Partners who had once doubted me came forward with opportunities. People who had seen me as fragile now saw me as sharp and unyielding. The $1 million they tried to bury in their greed became the very rope that strangled their legacy, and it became the foundation of mine. With my wealth secure again, I didn't spend it on revengeful displays of luxury. No. I funded scholarships for children who had been silenced by poverty. I built a trust in my late husband's name to support widows who had no one else to turn to. I didn't let my money rot in vaults. I let it breathe so it could change lives. The Sharmas, meanwhile, spiraled. With their assets gone and their reputation ruined, they became the very thing they once mocked. Ordinary, struggling, begging. I saw them once, years later, in a small market, arguing with a vendor over the price of vegetables. They avoided my eyes, but I looked right at them and smiled. Not a cruel smile, but a knowing one. Because revenge is not about screaming in triumph. It is about watching the guilty collapse under the weight of their own sins while you rise above them. And in that moment I knew I had won. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had survived them. My daughter and I now live with peace they can never buy back. The $1 million they tried to steal had bought me something far greater. The sweet, irreplaceable taste of justice.